Hello, everyone. Welcome to Budget Basics for the ECRG program. My name is Natalie Nava. I'm the program manager with the Center for Creative Land Recycling. And today we have a webinar, just a short webinar on budget basics and how to make your application successful. And then by Sebastian Harrison, who is one of ECRG's revitalization specialists. And then we will also have DTSC staff available to answer any questions. But before we start, we wanted to launch a quick poll to get a sense of who's in the room and what your needs are. So please, we'll take a few minutes just to answer the questions, and then I'll let people know what the results are. I'm going to give it a few minutes because we have about 15 people who responded. So the questions are, what type of application or applications do you plan on submitting? Community-wide assessment, site investigation, or cleanup? And the second question is, where are you at in your process of developing a budget? Haven't started, have some pieces but need assistance, and I have one ready to go. Just give it another minute.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. It seems like we have a good mix of participants from the different applicant types.
Yes, we do. Okay, let's see. I think I'll just get started so we can move on. But so far we have about 19 people who've responded to the poll. Community-wide assessment has 37%. Site investigation, which is 45%, and cleanup is 48%. So of course these are shifting, but pretty even spread actually between the three out of the 20 people, and then who have answered the poll. And then as far as where people are at in their budget, in the 52% have some pieces but need assistance. We have 30% haven't started and 19% have one ready to go. Great, thank you for answering those. And then Sebastian, would you like to get started?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much for running that poll. I think it's nice to sort of see where everyone is in the process. You know, from a project management standpoint, I'm sure a lot of you have prepared budgets for other reasons, but part of the task in front of you is, you know, adapting your budget for the ECRG, understanding the eligible costs, as well as what else that you might include. So let's get started. As Natalie said, this is about cost estimating and budgeting for the ECRG. My name is Sebastian. I'm an environmental engineer. I used to work on the East Coast in the chemical industry as a construction engineer in environmental remediation. And currently I am working for the Center for Creative Land Recycling. So before we jump into the presentation, just wanted to share the mission of ECRG. Our mission is to promote the sustainable, equitable, and responsible reuse of underutilized and environmentally impacted properties. So we work with all stakeholders to revitalize communities through land recycling, and we are a BTAP for US EPA for 10 states and numerous territories around the county, including the BTAP for DTSC and this program. Again, on the screen, this is just some of the things that ECRG does for you. If you're curious for more, please visit our website or get in touch. This is the specific ECRG team assisting the ECRG program. I'm sure if you've attended the other webinars, you've probably heard most of us speak. There's Ignacio, David, Janet, and myself. And then we also have outreach and communication specialists, Devin, Tony, and Natalie, who you heard speak just a couple moments ago. Okay. So competitive ECRG applications will have to present a clear and defensible budget. You know, ultimately, you know, this grant is the money that you're requesting. All the money that you're requesting has to be included in your budget. So we're going to describe what those budget elements should do, What are the eligible costs? What are the ineligible costs? We're also just going to cover a quick grounding in the cleanup process, because we recognize that some folks might be new to brownfields or new to preparing cost estimates. Then we're also going to have Natasha with DTSC provide an overview of the ECRG budget template in Flux, because ultimately all applications will have to be submitted in Flux. And then finally, we're going to end with a question and answer. So if you have any questions, please share them in the chat. Natalie will keep track of them, and then we'll do our best to revisit all of them at the end of the presentation. Okay, again, the ECRG is specific to brownfields. So what are brownfield sites? A brownfield is a property where the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. So that means it's either known to be contaminated, or there could be the perceived contamination, which you could be using ECRG funds to further investigate. And why is cost estimating for brownfields challenging? What makes it different? Because instead of, building parking lots in vacant space, we're dealing with the underground, with the subsurface. It's dark down there. It's difficult to really say what an average site is, because the second you say average, people place their expectations, and there could be very different contamination at the site. You really need to know the history, the prior use, and other specifics about the site in order to provide an accurate cost. So a brief overview of what some of these cost factors might be that a construction engineer would use in preparing your estimate, or for you to consider, and sort of what the range of costs would be. The size, the layout, the access of the site, how many acres your site is, how difficult it is for contractors to get on and off the site. How mature is the site program and the information? With regards to performing a phase one, this could be very important. How much do we already know? Have samples ever been collected at the site? Is the contaminant delineated, or do we just know that there is contamination? Again, the location of the site, the vendors, the proposed cleanup technology is huge. Again, this is many steps in the remedial process. You'll be considering what technologies to use. These will have big implications on the end cost, as well as the reuse of the site. A dig and haul might make more sense for this program, because ultimately you need to show completion within 2 years, whereas something like a groundwater pump and treat might take longer, and the yearly O&M costs will not be reimbursable under this grant program. You need to consider the proposed end use of the site. Again, this is where you want to consider the cleanup and the reuse perhaps as one item. Are there any elements of the cleanup that can be built into the reuse if you're still at that stage in the project? To build your budget and to think about the cost factors, you need your project scope. We're going to talk about this more in detail, but ultimately it's your scope that accounts for your budget, which needs to be on your schedule. This is ultimately your remediation time plan, and we're going to go into the schedule attachment later in the presentation. But something to note, that the pace of the cleanup does impact costs. So when you're considering the cost and submitting it for this program, you have to ensure that you're lined up with that timeline that you're submitting to DTSC. And again, that timeline is trying to see all ECRG activities completed within 2 years. Here are some big terms for grounding. I won't spend too much time here, but just wanted to cover these basics before we talk about the 3 grant types. We have a phase one, which is sort of the beginning in the process, which is more of a research report, where we're just trying to identify, are there recognized environmental conditions at the site? Is there contamination here or not? A phase two is when we begin the soil and groundwater sampling. We begin delineating the contamination. Phase three, ultimately, we're planning at this point, building our remedial action work plan, until finally we're in the cleanup and remediation standpoint. So for the CWA applications, we're largely considering, the phase ones and the phase twos that we would bundle into one application to perform in an area. For the investigation grants, this is where we're looking at, more the phase two, the environmental site assessments, as well as the cleanup and remediation planning, the building of the remedial action work plan that we need to do before we can, firmly wrap our arms around, what will the work be and how much will it cost to perform. And then finally, we have our cleanup and remediation, which should be submitted under the cleanup grant. Here's another just brief overview of the regulatory process for a site, just sort of covering, what are the steps that sites move through and ultimately will follow as part of this ECRG program. So we can see the evaluation, the remedy selection, and then ultimately we're moving into the actual cleanup grants where we're doing the implementation. The public participation activities I just want to mention again, because those are reimbursable under this grant, and those are the type of community engagement activities that DTSC would like to see, the applicant performing. Are you informing the community and getting their input on the work of the cleanup and the end reuse of the site? Here are the types of applications again, just summarized in large. And again, you can see, this is the guidelines text, again, summarizing the phase 1s and phase 2s and community engagement activities that you would include in a CWA application. The phase 1, phase 2 work and other investigation and, remedial action preparation that you would include in an environmental investigation. And then ultimately the environmental cleanup. And then I want to point this out because this has been changed in the guidelines because there was a bit of, back and forth and confusion. A regulatory approved cleanup plan is highly recommended for a site specific cleanup application. It is not mandatory, but it is highly recommended for a competitive cleanup because again, to have a competitive application, there needs to be some confidence that you're going to be able to perform the work as proposed and ultimately agreed to. Here you can see the grant ranges of the costs. Again, a minimum of $80,000 for all 3 grant types, going up to $300K for CWAs, $3 million for environmental investigations, and $7 million for environmental cleanups. Environmental estimates change over time. It's the nature of cost estimating, especially, like I said, in the remediation industry, where we're dealing with limited information, changing information, and ultimately, a site conceptual model that we're building as we understand, the extent of the contamination and what we're going to have to do. So I share this EPA Superfund guidance chart just to sort of highlight this fact and then bring up the fact that ultimately to submit the cleanup application, you want to be at this final design point where again, you're within this confidence interval of, about 10% on what your actual costs are going to be before you complete the remedial action. Again, this can be helpful just to understand as you're looking at site costs and building your estimates, that these things are going to change over time and that you should, be screening these alternatives as well as, making sure to document what are your assumptions in every cost estimate that you can go back to them and update them as the information, changes and grows. This is just a reiteration of that point that again, we should be documenting our assumptions, data sources and uncertainties, both for DTSC, being able to provide that information and so we can also update them. Ultimately, this is a reimbursement grant. The applicant is not going to be given, a blank check or a large sum of money. Instead, they're going to be submitting the invoices as they arrive for reimbursement from DTSC. And those will be, 90-day payment terms. So, or, roughly 90 days for reimbursement. So that's important to factor in as you're sort of building your contracting picture, and when your invoices will be paid. And again, if there are any changes to the ECRG scope or the costs that you're expecting to see, those need to be presented to DTSC, as soon as practical in writing, and DTSC will address them on a case-by-case basis. But, ultimately it'll be subject to, different factors like ultimately what is the, funding available for these change requests. That being said, Marianne, do you have anything else to add to on this point?
Thanks, Sebastian. Nothing really to add, but I did want to reiterate and remind everyone that this is a new grant. You guys who are participating in this grant, you're all part of, like, the first class, and so there's a lot that we are learning along with you. And we've had a lot of questions from future applicants about requests to change the scope or costs. And our answer really is that we'll figure it out on a case-by-case basis. Generally, what I can say is that adjusting the scope without a cost change, I think, and I predict, will be a little bit easier. Adding costs, I think that's where it really might get tricky, because it really depends on many, many more things. And so, I don't have a lot more to add, Sebastian, but I did want to reemphasize that. So thank you for giving me the floor for a moment.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that, just because I know, changing costs is obviously, top of mind for project managers.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks.
Okay, so before we cover a little bit more detail of what you should be including or how you might build that budget, let's talk about what you shouldn't include. And these are the things that will negatively impact your score, and will have to be, altered in your application for the final agreement. You cannot include activities that occurred before the ECRG award. Building material surveys and removals are not included as well. We'll cover this a little bit later. Building demo could be included in a cleanup grant if necessary to perform the work, but that should be reviewed with DTSC on a case-by-case basis. I won't read through all of these line by line, but again, just another highlight, again, mentioning that long-term O&M is not an eligible cost. So you could include the implementation of a remedy, but the costs in 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, that will have to be funded somewhere else. Penalties or fines are not eligible costs, so you'll have to be sure that you understand your payment structure and that you're not incurring those unnecessarily. Construction of the reuse project beyond what is required for the final remedy of the site. So your excavations that don't have to do with contamination or the environmental cleanup, that work is not reimbursable. And you should do your best to clarify and make that clear to DTSC that the work that you're including is part of the remedy for the site. DTSC does not want to see budget contingency as a separate line item. Again, you should clearly state your assumptions and document any changes as necessary. And then ultimately, this point at the bottom, that it's only the activities in the ECRG agreement that will be eligible costs. So to build a budget, you have to begin with what's the scope of work that you're going to be performing. So we talked a little bit about the phase 1s and phase 2s that we would include in the CWA and site investigation work. We talked about ultimately the environmental cleanup or remedial action work that we would include in a cleanup grant. We should also consider, what are the community engagement activities as well? Those will be eligible costs, and you should certainly consider that in the scheduling of your work. Again, you can include site clearing and demo costs if it's necessary as part of the cleanup, so this should be considered. Markups 8%. The project management costs that the grantee is going to incur in managing the ECRG work, that is eligible and should definitely be considered by the applicant. Ultimately, the ECRG work needs to be paid at prevailing wage. So you should consider that in all of your cost and budget estimates to make sure that that's reflected and you're using the correct labor estimates. And then just one last point here, something that we saw in the pre-app phase that we do expect to change in the full application just because it is more serious, but your budget must have detail. If you're requesting, $1 million, it's not enough to just say that this is field work that's covered underneath contracts. You need to provide the breakdown of that or show DTSC, where they can review that information to understand, what's ultimately building, up to the requested amount of the grant. So I mentioned the scope activities. A great way to consider, what is the scope of the work that you would perform under your grant is to review the schedule attachment. So this is another attachment that the applicant is required to fill out. And this is so that DTSC can understand the overall, schedule and scope of the activities that are going to be performed. And I share this because if you're, accounting for something on your schedule, you probably need to account for it in your budget as well. So you can read through here. Again, what are the major line items by the grant types? We see our phase 1s, our phase 2s for the CWA work, the community engagement that we would include. Very similar for the environmental investigation grants and the cleanups. And so on the next page, you can see I've done a little bit more work to begin filling this out. So as you click the arrows, you can build out what is the status of all of these things. And this is the cost example that Natasha is going to walk us all through a little bit more when we go into Flux. So we can see the example tasks, that were provided, in an environmental report of what the work will cost to perform, prepared by a consultant. And this is all the work that ultimately needs to be built into this schedule. And so where this work, if we're putting the start date and the completion date for the community engagement, why not mention that the scope and budget is included in the additional information as well? Sorry, accidentally jumped slides here as well. So I'm not going to spend too much time here because Natasha is going to walk through this example in Flux in a little bit more detail. But I just wanted to share sort of how different parts of the application are related to each other. And ultimately, when DTSC is trying to understand your application, your budget needs to, make sense in relation to the schedule. Where can you find costs to build a budget? Again, you could look at the past performed projects if the applicant has done any very similar projects in the area or is able to find other people that can provide those costs as well. Again, we're trying to consider more recent projects so within 10 years, but if it was, a full 10 years ago, that's where we would want to consider inflation or labor rates. But these are, again, things that can be built into an estimate. There are many cost databases and software available on the market for doing this type of estimating work, such as RS Means. Racer is a popular software, and I share there the Federal Remediation Technologies Roundtable, which has many great case studies on different types of environmental remediation, cleanup technologies. Often, the most accurate costs come from the people that will be performing the work. So solicitation from qualified prospective vendors is a great way to build your budget costs. Again, here we want to be considering, fair and equitable competitive processes. So, as you're requesting rates, are you presenting the same information to everybody? Are you having a bid walk where appropriate? Are you making sure to present a consistent scope to your vendors so that they're bidding on the same thing? Again, these are all important factors, and it's important to note that it doesn't have to be a bid event. You could also do an RFQ, where you're requesting quotes from your vendors. But ultimately, there can be a great deal more accuracy given by the people, that will actually be performing the work, versus, the engineers in the office trying to figure out what it would cost to perform the work. That being said, we still may want to consider, especially if we're new to brownfields or cost estimating, engaging a consultant or professional services to review the project and do this for us. Again, once we're at the cleanup stage, this is where we want to have an environmental consultant likely on board, to be preparing our remedial action work plan and building those more detailed cost breakouts. If you have any follow-up questions that we're not able to cover in the question and answer session, or if you have any other follow-ups of how you might engage a consultant or what some prospective vendors might be, feel free to request technical assistance at the Calendly link there, or please send a link to the ECRG email that you can see right on screen. Okay, so just one last thing from me before I hand it over to Natasha. Some endpoints of major cost factors for your budgets. Ultimately for the CWAs, the huge factor is going to be how many phase 1s and phase 2s we're performing. What is the other community engagement work that we're including in our application? That's a great starting point. And, perhaps coming up with a cost estimate of what a phase 1 takes to perform on such and such site in an area, and then multiplying that by the number of sites. For site-specific investigations, we have to consider that not all investigations are the same, and that we should be discussing with our regulator, what's ultimately going to be required for the number of samples in the analyte suite. Are we going to have to be including 100 samples in our sampling plan? Or is it a smaller site and a simpler site where, 10 samples could be sufficient? That's going to have a huge factor on your costs. And the last point here, just restating this point, that for cleanup, the cost estimate should be based upon an approved cleanup plan. And if not an approved cleanup plan, then a reviewed and prepared with a regulatory agency cleanup plan that DTSC can have confidence in. You should be providing your unit prices where these are very significant. And, one big example here where I have history is in waste transportation and disposal, where facility selection and how far, we're sending our trucks to dispose of the waste can have a huge factor on cost and should definitely be considered when scoping out that project. Again, we should be reviewing beforehand, is this the appropriate waste facility that will accept this waste? And is there anything that we can do, again, in considering the options for the project? Okay, thank you all for listening to me speak and just review some of the basics of how you would build a budget for the ECRG application. I'm going to now hand it over to Natasha to talk a little bit more about the Flux portal and how exactly the budget functionality works there.
Thanks, Sebastian. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and walk you through entering a sample budget that Sebastian used earlier. Okay, so once you've logged into the Flux portal and you've started an application, you'll see the records that you've already started here in your pending requests. You'll go ahead and go into edit mode on the application that you'd like to add your budget to. And you will scroll down to section 9. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to point out is that this is the functionality you need to upload cost estimates. And on the left side here, I have an example budget, which has the same line items that Sebastian used in his earlier example from the schedule attachment. So you would just go ahead and use this button to upload any attachments to show a detailed view of the work that you're planning to perform. So for this one, I started to enter the tasks already, and I'll go ahead and show you how to continue entering tasks. Keep in mind that each task is going to have to be entered on its own, and how you decide to break this work down is up to you because you know the project best. So I've already entered the first task that we have, scoping and work plan. And I've also added some grantee project management cost on top of the contract costs here. So I'll go through and just add each task to show you the high level items that we'd like to see in this grantee budget table. So the next task I'll enter is task 2, which is field preparation and coordination. So you'll give the task a name. If you have estimated start and end dates, you can enter them here, but you've likely already done that on your schedule attachment. You'll scroll down and you'll enter the total allocation for that task in the specific categories. So in this case, for contracts, it's going to be 28,010. And then up to 5% for that is going to be 1,400. So you'll enter these numbers, you'll save, and the table will update. I'll continue going through this. Task 3 is environmental investigation. We have 30,390 estimated for that. And then I'm going to add grant project management cost on top of that, again, up to 5%. And as you can see, as I'm saving these tasks, they're populating here, showing the total amount, but they're also populating here, showing where the values are allocated, whether it's contracts, project management, or travel. So in this case, we've estimated 10,530. So what's important to note here is in this table, we just want to see a high level breakdown of these tasks, whereas the uploads that you'll provide using this button or even the additional documents at the bottom are where you would show greater detail for the estimated costs that you have. Okay, just a couple more to go. Okay, so those are all the tasks that we have in this sample budget here, but I'm also going to add a task for community engagement. And that the backup you provide for that may be different or it may not be necessary depending on what it includes. So like I said, you can see that it's populated here and it's showing you a total value. Another thing that's important to note is that you want this total value here to be reflected in this total dollars requested for ECRG activities. The number that you put here should be the same as what's showing as the total for both of these tables down here. Right, so that concludes my section of it. I'm going to go ahead and hand it back to Natalie for question and answer.
Thank you, Natasha. So the first question we got is site preparation such as erosion control eligible? Oh, you're on mute, Sebastian.
I'm sorry. Thank you. I believe that was one of the case by case basis type costs, but if it's like erosion control, like putting up silt fences or something like that associated with the performance of the remedial action work, I think that would be included. Anything to add from DTSC?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to echo what you said. If it is part of the remedy, then absolutely yes, that is something that we can cover. But if it is something that is just part of redevelopment or some other sort of site use that's not connected to the remedy, then it is not something that we can cover.
Excellent.
Okay, next question. I actually wanted to read a question that I just got emailed in case for folks who filled out the pre-application, which is not required. I got an email that said just now, I filled out a pre-application, but I haven't had time to go back into Flux. Will all my information be there?
Yes, the pre-application will be waiting for you.
I just wanted to make that clear for folks. Okay. Let's see. The next question I have is, can you post the link to the will the recording and present slides be available? Yes, they will be. We will email them to everyone. And then they're also on the YouTube, the CClear TV YouTube, which Devin put the link in the chat. So you can find any of our webinars there. And if you have any questions about the Flux portal, you can email applicationportal@dtsc.ca.gov, which is also in the chat. Okay, here's another question from Dana Justice. If the work plan is the maximum grant amount, 7 million for cleanup, is grant project management allowed on top of the 7 million, or will it need to be included within the 7 million request?
That's a great question. Maryam, do you have an answer now, or do we have to get back to Dana?
No. 7 million is the maximum ask. So the project management fee will have to be included in that 7 million.
Yep. So you'd have to include, 6 million, such and such, and build the 5% on top of that. So thank you.
That was a good question. Thanks for asking that.
Yep. And just, I guess, to restate the point that the project management fee needs to be in the requested amount in the grant application.
Great. Thanks for clarifying. Okay, the next question we have is from Shreya. Is it okay to enter costs which were incurred 6+ months ago?
No, you can only request reimbursement for costs that are performed when you have the ECRG agreement in place. But good question.
Yeah, and I just want to encourage folks, wherever you're at in your journey, please feel free to ask any questions. We're here to answer them. And while we wait to see if anyone has any other questions, Miriam, did you have any other thoughts on what, now that we've presented, what would make a successful application?
Sure, Natalie, thank you so much. And I do want to thank Sebastian for going through all of this information in a very thorough manner. As I mentioned before, this is a new process for us, and we're taking things, one step at a time. It's a little bit of a build as you go. What we are looking for when we review the budget detail that's provided by the applicants is that we want to have confidence that the work that you have costed out is work that meets the ECRG guidelines, and that it is work that can actually be completed within a 2-year time frame. So we will be looking at your budget standalone, but also in relation to the other components that you've presented about your investigation and the cleanup and the ask for the ECRG. We would obviously prefer that an environmental professional has been involved in developing the budget, at least for the investigation and the cleanup grant applications, because it really is all about making sure that our money is allocated and encumbered to projects that will spend our money wisely and allow us to be good stewards of this trust that the legislators have given us, and also kind of create that balance with good stewardship and projects that actually come to fruition and end up revitalizing the communities that is our target. So we just want everyone to keep that in mind, and helping us to find that balance in the overall narrative that you present in your application and specifically through your budget. And I do apologize for providing some of these like sort of really abstract concepts, but I think that's kind of where we are right now, not having had the opportunity of reviewing full application budgets. If you ask me the same question, I hope like next year, I'm sure I'll come up with a completely different answer. So thank you, Natalie, for posing that question.
Yeah, no problem. We have another great question here. We have two. Okay, so first I'll start with Lori Harris, and it's about community engagement. Please clarify when community engagement is to be done for the various applications. Community-wide assessment applicants can include the costs to be completed, meaning it hasn't happened yet. To be completed can include the costs of to be completed community engagement in the budget. So it does not have to be done before the grant is in place. Is this the same for the other applications?
Yes, although the expectations are different. You know, if you're at the stage of a cleanup grant, you know, there's probably the expectation that you've already done some community engagement in the past. But these are eligible costs for all three grant types. Miriam, is there anything else that you'd like to add to that?
No, I think we're good. Because we have such a strong focus on building equity. We do encourage innovative approaches to community engagement, and certainly that's something that when we review your grant applications, we'll be definitely keeping an eye out for. What we require in the grant is something that I can't really state to because we don't have a requirement for that. There's just a lot of things that we'd like to see. And ultimately, the requirement with your regulatory agency, because the regulatory agency may have some public engagement requirements. So those obviously kind of go hand in hand. And that's why when you're designing your budget and you're designing your community engagement process, keeping in mind what the regulatory requirements are also going to be a very important aspect of the application.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Here's another question from Michael. If a project scope is still evolving and therefore not at all, or maybe not all anticipated costs are yet known, can an application be submitted for the known anticipated costs, even if more steps are anticipated to get a site to a point of closure/completion?
You know, that's an interesting question. It sort of has to be thought about on a case-by-case basis if those future tasks are truly part of an investigation grant, or if those are, you know, really foreshadowed work for the cleanup. But ultimately, you know, it's the stage in the application which builds what cost should be, you know, built in. But if the, you know, remedial action costs cannot yet be, you know, firmly estimated within, you know, a good margin of error, then those should not be included.
Yes, Sebastian, I think you're absolutely right. I think for cleanup, it really is a little bit of a different story. If you're in investigation phase though, and suppose you've got one work plan that's pretty solid and you know exactly what you have to do, but there's a chance that that won't be your last investigation to get you to the point as, about deciding whether or not you need a cleanup, then I think there is the ability to be a little bit more predictive in designing your budget. In the end, having a conversation with your regulator as to what they think they're going to look for in this 2-year time frame, and also consulting with an environmental professional or your own consultant, I think is going to be really important. Now, if you are a consultant who asks that question, you know, I would say use your best scientific judgment in balancing what the site needs are, what, you know, your capacity is going to be to actually perform the work for that particular applicant or grantee, and also keeping in mind what the regulatory requirements and regulatory decision points are going to be. It's really important that these applications are designed not in a vacuum where they're completely aspirational. I think it's really important to engage the scientists, geologists, and engineers and the regulators in this conversation to help ground truth and balance what the knowns are against what we think may essentially need to be added on in the 2-year time frame.
Okay, I'll move on to the next question. Thank you, Miriam. If an applicant is close to cleanup but does not have an approved cleanup plan, is there a planned process to allow grant recipients to roll into a cleanup grant upon completion of the investigation work?
I think this is something that might be developed after we go through the first round of awards and we understand better, you know, what are the types of projects that are being moved forward with. Again, we understand that this is a bit tricky with regards to the timing. You don't need an approved cleanup plan to submit a cleanup grant. It's just highly recommended. So again, the devil's in the details of how close you really are. But regarding, you know, an actual rolling process, of investigation into cleanup. Miriam, could you comment on that?
Yes, this is a really good question. And Sebastian, as you know, we've been having a lot of internal discussion about this. And I think it's one of the changes that we kind of went back and forth on a little bit when we moved from pre-application to full application. I would maybe look at it a little bit differently. If the cleanup plan is close to approval and you think that you've got the ability to be able to jump into that cleanup, fairly quickly within this 2-year time frame, then you might be better off applying for a cleanup grant. One of the things that Sebastian mentioned is that we are trying to get this money spent, and what we were afraid of are early stage cleanup plans that haven't been vetted, that may take 6 to 9 months to go through the regulatory approval process, and that cuts into your time frame, and then disencumbrance of allocated money ends up being a difficult process for us, we assume. Just given how our accounting is set up. And so that's why we were originally asking for approved cleanup plans to be the entry point for the cleanup grants. But after we had discussions with stakeholders, and a lot of people presented us with the scenario of a near approved cleanup plan, and that's when we came up with this idea of it being highly recommended to help us ground truth the budget and the schedule. So, we may need to have a follow-up with the asker of this question to maybe vet out exactly where they are to help guide them a little bit better. But the responses that Sebastian and I both provided are fairly broad and generic.
Yeah, so Dana, please feel free to follow up and reach out to ECRG, and we can set up a technical assistance session. And that goes, of course, for everyone on the call. We're here to support your application. I'm going to move to another question from Shreya. For a cleanup project, I incurred community engagement costs in September to October 2021. Will these costs not be eligible under ECRG?
That's correct. Those costs are not eligible. But if you want to repeat that community engagement work again, do something similar, once you have an agreement in place, that would be eligible. But costs can only be eligible if they're incurred while there's the ECRG agreement in place.
Right, thank you. Okay, and then so far we have one more question from Jack Wong. It seems that the application, scope, and budget should be thorough, concise, and clear. Would you recommend that an engineering consultant be consulted or contracted to complete the application? Because the level of detail and costing must be very accurate and may be above the normal experience level of city staff who does not work within soil remediation work on a regular basis.
Again, I think this factors into Mariam's point of what stage you are in and what type of grant you're looking at. But again, if you're looking to submit a cleanup grant where ultimately, you're remediating soil, you're performing an environmental, cleanup at a site, that's where you're going to want to talk to environmental professionals and have a more thorough cost estimate for the soil remediation work. At the other stages, really, that's part of the applicant's, choices of how comfortable they feel in cost estimating, but it could absolutely help to engage a consultant to do this work.
I did want to jump in and point out that DTSC and CClear, we're not requiring or recommending that a consultant be retained and paid to complete these applications. When we set up these applications, we try to design them with our applicants in mind, and hope that if someone were able to gather the information, because the grant application is more than just this budget, there's a lot that goes into it. And so we try to design it that a consultant or contractor would not have to be hired to complete the entire application. That being said, the applications do have to provide very technical information. So it really depends on the relationship that you have with a consultant. Some consultants are able to provide some estimates, for free. Some applicants may have a consultant on retainer. If you're very under-resourced and don't have access, contact ECRG. ECRG may be able to provide you with some support through their bank of consultants who are willing to donate some time to some of these entities who are interested in applying for ECRG funds. So we did not want to create an application with a strong focus on disadvantaged communities and then create a situation where disadvantaged communities needed additional resources just to complete the application. So we tried to balance that as much as possible. So I know it's a little bit broader than what the question asked, but I did want to kind of make that point of emphasis that we tried to make the application designed in a way that it was not required to hire a consultant. And we definitely have both DTSC staff available and ECRG on tap to be able to provide some additional guidance for anyone who feels that they need some.
Excellent clarification. Thank you, Miriam. And I just wanted to mention that we do have another webinar tomorrow, and that all attendees should definitely consider attending, especially if they have any questions on regulatory agency agreements. And regulatory agency agreements are required for the site investigation and cleanup applications.
Great. Well, that's the last question. We don't have any more questions. So just thank you. And is there any final thoughts that anyone wanted to share?
Natalie, I just did have one more thought, kind of going off of what Sebastian mentioned about tomorrow's ECRGenius webinar that we're hosting, that there have been a lot of very recent changes, especially on the local government regulatory authority. So if anyone is working with a local agency, I would highly recommend that they do take the time to join us tomorrow to learn a little bit more about what's going on in that area. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We're really supportive and we're here to support any other questions you may have. Thank you, Carol. Thanks for all the questions in the chat. Thank you for your time sharing this information with us. Have a great week.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.